And I think there's also a growing awareness and recognition that we need carbon removal. It's not because reduction is sort of the primary goal, but we need to be able to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And there is no other business model really out there for companies that develop this kind of technology than the voluntary carbon market.
Carbonsations, today's carbon industry leaders.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Today, we're joined by New York City-based attorney Peter Mayer, who's got over 20 years of experience in big law and currently specializes in carbon removals. Peter, as our first return guest on the podcast, I'm very happy to be having you on again, and I'm excited to continue and perhaps deepen the conversation we had with you last time, which, for those of our listeners who haven't heard it, there will be a link for that earlier episode in the description. So yeah, last time we talked about the specifics of putting together carbon removal deals and creating the contracts for those, which was very interesting and is your area of expertise. Since then, there's been a very exciting new development for the carbon market that took place a couple months ago, namely Frontier Climate, which is a consortium for big tech companies, which was established to manage advanced market commitments for carbon removal. So Frontier published its very own offtake agreement template, and the template can be accessed by anyone and is available on Frontier's website, making it a great contribution to the voluntary carbon market and perhaps compliance markets in the future. But Peter, as you're the contracts expert, what can you tell us about this template and how do you see it benefiting the industry?
Right. Well, thank you, Violet, for having me back on the show. I'm really glad to be back on. And I think there's indeed quite a bit we can talk about. So the Frontier offtake agreement template, I was very excited when it came out, and I devoured it basically when I read it the first time. So I think that it is extremely helpful for a number of reasons. All we have in the voluntary carbon market is really, it's all just contracts and contracts again. And what this market there is lacking is a set of templates, a set of standards. And I think this is a very valuable contribution to that, to filling that gap and so bringing a bit of clarity into the market. Carbon suppliers always have not always, but sometimes or very often have there's a mismatched expectation between suppliers and buyers as to what these agreements are supposed to entail and what's supposed to be in there. Suppliers, most of those people working for those companies are chemical engineers or techies. They don't have a legal background. They don't need to have one. But there comes a lack of, there's a lack of information that comes with that and a lack of understanding on both sides. So that's why I welcome this template a lot, because I think it helps to bring clarity and it helps to structure deals. Of course, there are a few things when you go into details that are need to be discussed and negotiated on a case-by-case basis. The template is as expected. It is leaning, towards, it's mainly buyer-friendly, which is fair enough. It is, there are very few buyers out there compared to the supply that we have, and buyers have a lot of leverage to determine terms for contracts. So that's, that's fair enough. But the agreement is not overly one-sided. I think it's quite balanced. There are a few things that may be difficult for suppliers to swallow, like the right of first offer for future projects, which, if I read it correctly, seems to apply for all perpetuity. The background to this is that when the buyer says, well, we enter into an offtake agreement with you, and we support your technology, we support your project. You're still a very early stage company, so we want to participate in your future success, which is why you need to give us a right of first offer for future credits on other projects that are not part of this current agreement. Now, that may be difficult to swallow for a supplier. Price adjustment mechanism, where the buyer says, if you sell credits in the future to other buyers, price that's more favorable to the buyer than to the price we agree on in this agreement now, we have a right to adjust the price. Those are things that would need to be discussed. But as a general comment, I welcome the template. I think it's very robust, solid. It's fairly balanced, and it can be a really valuable contribution to the lack of understanding as to what is an offtake agreement and what needs to go in there.
And how flexible would you say this template is? Like, how much of it needs to be adjusted from deal to deal?
Right. So it's interesting now that by putting this out, Frontier is basically saying, well, these are the terms that we are prepared to agree on when you contract with us. And, you might like it or not, but that is a statement that they're making by putting it out. And I think suppliers would be ill-advised just to accept it. There are some modifications that should be made. It also depends on the project stage, obviously, and then there are various variables that would need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. I think structurally, most of it is already in there. That's important for offtake agreements. And it's really it comes down to the details where you don't need to reinvent the wheel if you use it, but you got to pay attention to the details and make, where possible, adjustments to adopt to the specific situation the supplier is in.
And have you used the template yourself, or is it something that you will be using or plan on using in future deals, or is your personal experience facilitating carbon removal deals kind of sufficient as it is?
That's a great question, Violet. So we have not used the agreement ourselves yet. But having said that, we have taken a few ideas and have introduced them into the templates that we have developed for our clients. So there were a few things in there which I thought, that's interesting. Yeah, we could make use of that ourselves. The agreements in this space become more and more mature as do the technologies that are deployed in this space as well. The first agreements that I saw 2 or 3 years ago when I entered this space were really substandard. And this has become way better, more mature, more sophisticated. And having said that, the agreements that I wrote 2 years ago, I would make, I probably wouldn't write them the same way today, because the legal understanding also evolves over time, just as the entire market does. And that's also something that's just so fascinating about CDR, is that it is so fast moving, and the market evolves, the technology evolves, policy evolves, legal frameworks and contracts evolve. That's just very, very fascinating. And so some ideas of these contracts, we going to implement them for our templates as well.
Can you share an example?
There's some language around sort of mitigation outcomes, CORSIA, how to avoid double counting. There's some elegant language there that isn't too detailed and allows for enough flexibility, but that's quite helpful. Also, the remedy section is also fairly balanced. They don't go to, they're not asking for monetary damages right away. There's some leeway with respect to replacement credits. There are some interesting ideas in there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Moving on to more recent events, I know that you attended this year's edition of New York Climate Week. Can you share some of your impressions of the event with us, particularly as it has to do with carbon removals and carbon markets? Like, how much attention did these sectors get?
Sure. So my perception is a bit subjective, I gotta say, because obviously I attended events that had some kind of focus on carbon removal and carbon markets. But my observation is that it is more and more on the agenda, and that there's a lot of publicity in that respect and awareness. So I started basically on Sunday, the day before it was officially opened, with attending a movie screening about climate, how climate change affects community and close to the Mississippi. And then the next day, I went to the Flow Carbon event, and on Tuesday to the Puro event. And the participants there were basically the same people. So we are a bit in a CDR bubble. But what was good to see is that there are more people there and new faces as compared to last year. So there is a growing interest in CDR, and the community is growing. And I think that is a very good sign. We are still a bit in a bubble. And I think what we need to do is, and that's why I love this podcast, because it is a wonderful tool to achieve that, to create awareness about CDR outside our bubble. We're all comfortable talking about permanence and talking about additionality, and we all know what it means. But when we talk to someone outside of this space, they don't know what we're talking about. And we need to learn to explain these terms in a way that people understand it, and that we can create awareness and interest in CDR. And I think that's sort of one of the lessons that I'm taking away from New York Climate Week this year, is that I want to try to talk more about it to people that are not in this space. It was very helpful to solidify existing relationships, making new connections. That was great, but I also want to use the next few months to go a bit more out and talk to people about CDR that don't know a lot about it.
Sorry, do you plan on speaking on any other events?
Maybe not this year, but maybe next year. I'm going to be at Carbon Unbound next year in London. Maybe there's an opportunity that comes up to speak at an event. One thing that I wanted to mention, for those who don't know about it, there's a movie screening I attended during New York Climate Week. The movie is called Legion 44, and it's all about carbon removal. I think most people listening to this podcast might know about it. Many people listening to this podcast are in the movie, so I'm not going to tell anything new to them. But for those who are new to this space and would like to learn a little bit about carbon removal, I think this is a great entry into this space, Legion 44.
Absolutely. There will be a link for that as well in the description.
Great.
While we're on the subject of climate events, though, COP29 is just a few weeks from now, and Article 6 negotiations are expected to be concluded during the summit. What are your thoughts on this, and how do you expect talks to go?
Right. Well, maybe I just take one little step back to live up to the goal that I just set myself, and even on the risk of boring some people listening in. For those who are new to CDR, maybe it's helpful to just to give a little bit of background on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement as to what this actually is. Just going to take 20 seconds. So the question is, how can developing countries put forward ambitious climate pledges under the Paris Agreement? It's Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is supposed to enable international cooperation to tackle climate change and to provide and unlock financial support for developing countries. And Article 6 has basically three tools or three cornerstones to achieve that. One of these cornerstones is going to be more interesting in the context we're talking about. But so Article 6.2 allows countries to exchange mitigation outcomes bilaterally. Article 6.4, which is where the voluntary carbon market comes in, we're supposed to establish a mechanism for the validation, verification, and issuance of carbon credits. Article 6.8 is outside the markets. I'm not going to talk about that. Article 6.4 is really sort of the crucial aspect for voluntary carbon market carbon removal. Article 6.4, is it good to go or not? And there has been huge expectations for last COP and the COP before that. The question is, so what happens at COP29 next month? I don't have tremendous expectations in it. It is a highly political environment where people have different kinds of interests, different kinds of agendas. So I wouldn't, set my hopes too high on this one. There is also, it's even to me unclear as to sort of what the various or how the procedure is. So Article 6.4 is basically supposed to give the supervisory body that is supposed to develop this mechanism for the verification and issuance of credits, the power to set these rules. But then there's an annex to the Paris Climate Agreement where it says that the supervisory board basically only supervises this crediting mechanism under the authority and guidance of the parties. So whatever the supervisory body might decide, could that then be overruled by the parties? It's not entirely clear. So we also have this procedural uncertainty about who is actually the decision-making body, and is that the supervisory board? And if so, can that be overruled? So it's a very tricky field, and it is a bit confusing. But there's one thing that came out just a few days ago, which I thought was pretty good. The Article 6.4 Sustainable Development Toolkit. That I thought was a huge step forward in setting sort of binding rules for the implementation and operation of social and environmental impact studies, so that it's supposed to prevent instances that we've had in the past, like there was the circumstance of local villages in Uganda that had used land to grow their food, but then they couldn't use it anymore because there was a tree planting project on their land. So these are obviously things we would like to avoid in this context. And this development toolkit that the supervisory body adopted just a few days ago gives a lot of guidance on that. And I thought that was really a huge step forward. So I don't want to be too negative about Article 6.4 because there are obviously also good things coming out of it, and it keeps sort of the discussion going. But I wouldn't be too hopeful that we will have an operational mechanism after COP29.
All right. So with that said, whether or not there's forward movement on Article 6, we are certainly seeing that carbon removal is growing. And as you mentioned, there's a rising interest toward this space. But the question here is whether the momentum can be sustained and whether or not there will be enough buyers in the mid and short term of the market to keep growing. What's your view on this?
Well, I'm hopeful on that. I really am. There are a number of underpinnings, I think, that help develop the market. There are more and more insurances that get into this space. Contracts are becoming more sophisticated. More and more buyers are taking an interest in it, or potential buyers, I should say. That's at least my observation, that they're looking at this. Many of them are still in a wait and see mode. But I think that there is a momentum. And I think there's also a growing awareness and recognition that we need carbon removal. It's not because reduction is sort of the primary goal, but we need to be able to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And there is no other business model really out there for companies that develop this kind of technology than the voluntary carbon market. It's the only way for them to monetize their product. So the voluntary carbon market is very important. There is, having said all that, there is also a lot of scrutiny that comes with it. There are scandals that have sapped investor appetite. We all know about the article in The Guardian some time ago, which basically said that many nature-based offsets are basically junk. So there's a lot of scrutiny. There's a lot of negative press. And on the other hand, there is a tremendous amount of human ingenuity in developing technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And I'm very hopeful that this momentum can be sustained. And the human factor in that plays a significant role. It's really, I think everyone working in this space can testify to sort of the optimism of the players in the market their ingenuity, their keenness to develop new technologies and to working towards a common goal. So I'm very optimistic about that. And then there is also, these are all sort of soft factors. Then we also have the US Department of Energy that is putting tremendous resources into that financially, policy-wise. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US has been just a tremendous tool to boost this industry. Department of Energy is buying credits themselves, which is a testament to where they want to say, we believe in this market, we believe in the integrity of this market, we believe in the credibility of the credits we are buying. And I think these are very important signals, which is why I'm quite hopeful that this momentum can be sustained. But it's a very delicate flower, and it needs to be well taken care of.
For sure it is. I'm glad you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, actually, because it is a pretty hot topic right now and something that's on everyone's minds, particularly as the elections are nearing. And there are worries that if Trump becomes president again, that he might do away with the Inflation Reduction Act. How likely do you think that is to happen? And if it does happen, do you think that carbon capture and direct air capture in the US can grow without it?
Yeah, well, we're a bit in a nail-biting situation here. We are like, 650 hours away from election day. It's about 3.5 weeks. It's a very tight race. It's been impossible to predict its outcome. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act, I think it has become the law of the land. I don't see a Trump administration even having the will to rescind it. Because interestingly enough, it is mainly red states, Republican-led states, that benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act the most. So I don't think there's an interest in rescinding it. What a Trump administration possibly could do is replace people at the Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, with people that are maybe less climate focused. People I speak to and know at the Department of Energy, they are very convinced about what they're doing. So there's some room for some overhaul in personnel, saying, well, maybe we can put people there not so convinced about carbon removal or climate change, but in principle, the Inflation Reduction Act is not going to be removed. The implementation of it may be slowed down, but it's not going to go away.
I hope so. Peter, I've got a final question for you before we wrap up this episode, and that is regarding your thoughts on the SBTi and their approach to carbon removal, as well as their potential acceptance of using carbon credits to offset Scope 3 emissions.
Right. I think that ties a little bit into what we sort of spoke earlier about sort of the momentum of carbon removal and how this can be sustained. And the SBTi controversy is really a bit at the core of this. So the SBTi, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, is, I think, one of the predominant provider of standards for companies to set decarbonization and net zero targets. There it sets and defines sector-specific standards, target setting standards, and it validates companies' pathways to that, to those goals. Scope 3 emissions are those that are sort of the hardest to abate, and the SBTi's Board of Trustees announced plans to loosen the restrictions that they had previously in there and still have in their criteria to use carbon removal credits also outside of Scope 3. And that created a huge upheaval and outcry, because it would say that it would enable greenwashing, and we don't want it. Was basically seen as diluting existing principle, and that it would enable oil and gas companies to perpetuate their use of fossil fuel, because they would say, okay, we'll just continue business the way we do, and then we offset it by buying carbon removal credits. Now that's obviously not the intention, and that's not how it should be. But I think it asks the wrong question, and because if this is a very nascent industry and we want this industry to grow, then does it really matter to whom we sell carbon credits at this early stage? If every CO2 if every ton of CO2 removed from the atmosphere matters, should we be too concerned about at this point? Who buys a carbon credit? I don't necessarily have the answer for that, and I'm not, a policy advisor. I'm just thinking if there's no physical difference between CDR used to compensate ongoing emissions and CDR used for drawdown, and then is it not preferable for to incentivize maximum deployment of carbon dioxide removal, irrespective of who the buyer is, at least at this very early stage? Why should we discourage the use of removals to compensate for avoidable emissions? I don't know. I know it's a very controversial topic. There is, and when we talk about the voluntary carbon market for carbon removal, basically there is no market. There are few buyers, but the market has really developed. And if we want carbon removal to take off, we need to grow the market. And so I don't think that this fundamentalism is helpful in achieving that. I think what is needed is we need more policy rules in this space that sets sort of clear standards and rules, because that would help building integrity in this market, building credibility, and creating sort of a common framework. But until then, I think it is important to grow this market, and deploying carbon removal technologies is expensive. It's not easy and cheap to do that. So we need to give the companies that are developing these technologies the financial means to be able to do that. And I think being too fundamentalist about who buys carbon credits may be counterproductive. Now, I don't want the fossil fuel industry to continue doing business as usual. Of course not. It's not, at this point, I don't think it's a black and white situation, and there's some flexibility required, I believe.
I agree with you, actually. And another guest on the podcast, Dr. Jennifer Jenkins of Rubicon Carbon, actually argued the opposite, that companies that engage in the carbon market and buy offsets are actually more ambitious within their own, internal processes, and they do more to actually reduce their own emissions as opposed to offsetting them, in addition to offsetting them.
I agree. On top of it, I think that the SBTi controversy, I think what they achieved is just additional negative press to the industry. So I think they did the industry a disfavor by the staff, by sort of putting out this public revolt, really. I think they did some kind of disfavor there, because people who are critical of this market, they would say, yeah, look, they don't know themselves what they want to do. And I wasn't very happy about that.
Well, Peter, thank you. Thank you so much for your valuable insights. As always, it was a true pleasure to speak with you, and I hope we can do this again. A third time would be great.
Absolutely. I love the format that you have. Tremendous people on the show, fabulous guests, and I'm happy to contribute.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.